Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Don't sigh, Michael. And good afternoon to everyone who's joining us on the internet as well. And those of you on the internet have a question specific to something that we're discussing from the course, feel free to post your question. Okay. The illusions of the ego. All of you have rather sloppy definitions of the ego that tend to cause it to seem as though it is something that has a life of its own. And yet last week we found that the ego is nothing more than a thought system, a system of thoughts. Something made up. An infrastructure, you might say, of ideas strung together in a way that seem to give you a code for living and a means of understanding the kingdom of heaven without ever having to refer to the Father in order to understand the real meaning of the kingdom of heaven. And so using this thought system, you walk around in the middle of the kingdom of heaven, calling it the world and universe, which started with a big bang, that is purely physical, and this you call life. Now, imagine, if you will, that sometime in the not too distant future, you can go to the grocery store and you can buy packets, foil packets, little tiny foil packets of instant water. Freeze-dried water vapor, we'll say. And all you have to do, as with any other instant product, is bring it home, and no matter that the packet is very tiny, if you pour it into a glass and you add water. You're supposed to smile. Does anyone get it? Now, we'll bring it into focus. There isn't any such thing and can't be any such thing as dry water that can be put into a packet. But you can imagine kids pretending to have little packets of dry water, just little empty packets, and they pour it in, and then they add water. And they're amazed at how much you can make with just that little packet. Because their attention is on the packet, and they're ignoring the fact that that they are adding real water to nothing and ending up with as much real water as they want. They are consciously ignoring the facts and sticking with their imagination that they have created dried instant water that they can make as much as they want from. Now, the ego is like dry water. It's a bunch of nothing. But you all talk about the ego as though it's something. You say, what an ego he is. You define other people by their egohood. you say, boy, my ego is on the rampage today. And at other times you acknowledge that you are an ego. And yet, the ego is nothing but a thought system, a collection of ideas. You think of the ego as being willful, and therefore having a persona. That has the capacity to have an original intent and carry it out. And yet, the fact is that it is nothing but a thought system, a collection of thoughts and ideas that you believe and have committed yourself to. Now, the first step away from home was the mad idea, you might say. Father, I'd rather see it my way. I'd rather see all that is according to definitions I give it. In that act, you didn't realize that you were also giving yourself a definition that was nothing but dry water, nothing but nothing. You were saying, I have a capacity to see things on my own. I have a capacity to see things the way I want to see them. And that was the beginning of what you call the ego. But again, the ego is nothing but a packet of nothing. And the only way that it can seem to become something is if you add the real thing to it. And so, what is the only real thing you can add to an idea of an ego as a thing? It is the Christ that you are. It is what you really are. And so, as I said last week, you have developed beliefs, and you have made commitment to them. So now you believe them. You are the Christ pretending not to be the Christ and believing your belief. This is very important, especially as we go into this section about the illusions of the ego. Because all there is to your ego is a bunch of nothing, constituted of ideas not gathered from God, but from the imagination. In other words, created out of nothing, and the result of that creation is still a bunch of nothing, but with a bunch of complicated definitions that seem to have substance. And the only thing that makes the ego seem to be able to act with purpose is that your capacity to be the expression of purpose, which is real, has to be added to it. And then you have to consciously choose to ignore that you've added something real to it, so that you can think that the nothing that you made out of nothing has become something, just like the kids thinking that they put in a packet of nothing, added water to it, and the nothing became water. And they ignore the fact that the water that is there was real. Is that clear to everyone? So while we're reading about the ego here, we're not reading about you. We're not reading about a thing. We're not reading about anything that has a capacity to have a conscious intent. And you must remember that all there is to it is a Christ imagining that he or she has a capacity to conceive of himself or herself as something separate from what God is being, and then borrowing from the truth or the reality of himself or herself that which is real and adding it to the infrastructure of nothing, causing it to seem to be something capable of conscious intent, of conscious will, that can act, that can make, that can wish, and thus be a life force, if you will. So again, any ego you think you are, or any ego you think you see, is nothing but the divine one that God has created, pretending not to be the presence of God, believing that he or she is not the presence of God, and then consciously rejecting his or her source and abiding in this imagination, this system of thoughts. Once you understand this, you will see that the ego is nothing to deal with. It doesn't really exist. And that the solution to the problem of being an ego is to once again consciously remember your source. Consciously remember the only real author there is. And abandon any authority you thought you had, so that you begin to realize that whatever is experienceable is real by virtue of the Father's will, and what you thought it was is really non-existent. In doing this, in remembering your source like we read last week, you remember God is your Father, which makes you his Son, which makes you real. And in your acknowledgement of what you truly are, in your remembering what you truly are, the Father and the Son become one as a conscious experience, and you wake up. So I hope I've helped to make it clear that the ego is like a packet of dry water to which you must add something real, which is the divine one that you are, the Christ that you are, and that seems to give the ego life. But the life is drawn from what is real about you. This is very important. Even so, the life that the ego seems to have, by virtue of your having added something real to it, exists no more than the contents of the packet of nothing that were put into the glass before you added the real water to it. So again, the ego is nothing more than the divine one that you are, believing that you are not what you are, and suffering from your belief. But it still doesn't make your existence as an ego real. Therefore, the solution lies in remembering that right now in the middle of your dream, you are a divine one creating an illusion and believing it. And the only thing that is necessary in order to wake up is not to challenge the ego that you seem to have created, but to remember who you are and throw your allegiance on that side. Okay. Let us begin.
Chapter 4. The illusions of the ego. The Bible says that you should go with a brother twice as far as he asks. It certainly does not suggest that you set him back on his journey. Devotion to a brother cannot set you back either. It can lead only to mutual progress. The result of genuine devotion is inspiration, a word which, properly understood, is the opposite of fatigue. To be fatigued is to be dispirited, but to be inspired is to be in the spirit. To be egocentric is to be dispirited, but to be self-centered in the right sense is to be inspired or in spirit. The truly inspired are enlightened and cannot abide in darkness.
To be egocentric is to be dispirited. To identify with the ego is to be identified with the emptiness in the packet to which you added what was real about you. To get a divorce from your father by choosing to see things on your own is to put yourself in a place devoid of the Father, a place devoid of your source, at least in your imagination. And in effect, to become unplugged, and that is dispiriting. That causes you to lose your spirit. To be dispirited is to be fatigued. You find your energy draining because you're identifying with something non-existent in a place that's empty of anything. This is important. To be fatigued is to be dispirited, but to be inspired is to be in the Spirit. And so, as long as you have your back to the altar, you will feel weak and in a process of becoming constantly weaker. But when you turn toward the altar to ask of the Father, what does this mean? What does that mean? What do the petals on the rose mean? What did you intend by that petal on the rose? Then you open yourself up to be inspired, infilled with the knowledge of what is real, rather than being, you might say, infilled with the emptiness of something that doesn't exist.
It says here, the truly inspired are enlightened and cannot abide in darkness. I think where that causes confusion for me is that at times in my life I have felt inspired, but I don't think I've ever been fully awake or enlightened.
That is correct.
So what this is saying, that I'm sure many people have felt inspired by many things, but that's not the same kind of inspired as this is talking about.
No, that is not correct. True inspiration, the inspiration that is experienced because the penetration of truth has occurred, that is real. If you are listening to a speaker who jacks you up and who revs you up, if you call that inspiration, that is not inspiration, even though you might float out of there on a high.
Mm-hmm. Well, I find you inspiring at times. Is that?
Well, you'll also agree that it's never because I've jacked up your ego.
That's true. I
Yes.
see the difference. Okay, I'll pass the mic now.
Yes.
Okay, you can speak from the spirit or from the ego as you choose. If you speak from spirit, you have chosen to be still and know that I am God.
And I'm going to interrupt there. It might be helpful to remember that it's God that is saying this. And this would only need to be said to a Christ who has chosen to indulge in imagination and turn his back on the Father, and thus, as I said, steal authority from the Father in order to apparently engage it as an act of his own or her own. And so the Father says, be still, shut up, silence your mind, be still and know that I am God, not you. Be still and know that I am the Father and you are the Son, because this is how you remember who you are, which is the essential first step to coming back home into your right mind. Be still and know that I am the author. I am the source. And when you stop trying to be an independent source of things and let yourself back into me, you will find your conscious experience of being the experience of being the source, the experience of being the threshold where conception moves into creation. You will find yourself having the full-blown conscious experience of being me, which is your function. In other words, you and I are one, and I am that one. It's important that this be understood so that you might realize that the process of awakening will constitute the complete relinquishment of any authority you might have on your own. And yet, that will not mean that you will cease to be conscious of yourself as the Father individualized, period. And remember that I have said before that the Father individualized is universal and specific simultaneously. And I will let that just set with you. Let's continue.
These words are inspired because they reflect knowledge. If you speak from the ego, you are disclaiming knowledge instead of affirming it, and are thus dispiriting yourself.
That's important. When you go through your day without ever experiencing or allowing for a conscious idea of God, and without for a moment looking at anything that confronts you in your day, without remembering that if anything is going on there at all, it must be God, and therefore it must be more than what I'm experiencing at the moment, and therefore I want to be curious about what it really is. You are in the act of dispiriting yourself. You are in the act of pushing yourself further and further into the hole, further and further into ignorance, further and further into, quote, the problem of being, unquote. Now, am I trying to discourage you? No, I'm simply trying to show you that there's another choice available to you that is a significantly better choice, so that you might at least play with it once in a while, so that you might engage the conscious awareness once in a while, and then hopefully more and more frequently. Continue.
Do not embark on useless journeys, because they are indeed in vain. The ego may desire them, but spirit cannot embark on them because it is forever unwilling to depart from its foundation.
The ego may desire them. Oh, now there it sounds like the ego has a capacity to actually desire something all by itself because it is something real. The Christ who is choosing to ignore his Christhood and thus is experiencing his divinity in a fantastic, imaginative way, and I use the word fantastic with the sense of fantasy, that one, and all of them are, has become hooked on the challenge of overcoming the discomfort of trying to be something he isn't. And so that divine one, which is referred to here as the ego, that divine one brings its divine capacity to commit to something, to the overcoming of the discomfort of trying to be something it isn't. By doing something with the problem it perceives, rather than remembering its divinity and abandoning the game of imagination. So here's where the carelessness in language comes into play about the ego. You, the divine ones that you are, have imagined, and I know I'm being repetitive, have imagined out of whole cloth, out of nothing, out of the ethers, if you will, something that cannot be.